I'm thrilled to see you all. We have a wonderful talk today. And you know who it is, Dan Runner. Some of you might have not have met or seen him before, but he was our Rollins National Bank president for a long time too. So, but he's got a story to tell, so I'm just gonna let him do it. And it's being filmed, so behave.
Turn that on.
That might be my only saving grace. Thank you. I'm Dan Runner, and I figured what a better way to start than the way we start every morning, and that's with our sunrise. This is a sunrise over Troublesome Ridge, which you can see from town, just east of Saratoga. Another thing that I think is important in my family history, and that's the Overland Trail. A lot of my pioneer family and a lot of yours, if you go that far back, came along the Overland Trail and even the Oregon Trail and settled in this valley or parts near. So that is a picture of Fort Laclede on the Overland Trail. And I'll explain as we go why the Overland Trail becomes so important in my family. So this is a history about my pioneer roots in the North Platte Valley, and it also includes Pass Creek. My pioneer ancestors are Houston, Sears, McPhail, and Swanson on Spring. They're on mostly on Cow Creek. Swanson would be on South Spring. Allens would be on Pass Creek. Dodds and Alts would also be on Pass Creek. And of course, that evolves as the history goes along. So let's see here. My parents are Bill and Charlene Runner, and this is their wedding. They had a double ring ceremony in 1954, right after they graduated from high school at the Presbyterian Church here in town. And my mom, her maiden name was Allen, and both of them were born in 1936 in Rollins. Both of them were raised south of town. And they graduated, as I said, from Platte Valley High School, which is the Saratoga High School. I've got a yearbook over there that some of you will get a big hoot out of looking through, of 1954. The double ring ceremony included Billy Bernardo, which was Bill Bernardo's son, and a young lady from Laramie, Wyoming, which is Carrie Gray. They were best of friends, and they decided to get married after they graduated from high school on the same day, on December 12th. Now, so some of you are wondering whether they had to get married or not now.
No.
So my patriarchal lineage from my dad's side goes back to Houston, Sears, McPhail, and then Runner. So we start with Albert Houston. He was born in 1941 in Missouri, and he lived to 1915. And he came to the Laramie Plains exactly 100 years before I was born. He came to the Virginia Dale stage station on the Overland Trail, and he was hired to provide meat for the stage station, and then the next year he was providing meat for the fort that was in Laramie, Fort Saunders. Now, Albert Houston is quite a colorful character. He's my great-great-great-grandfather. And you're probably wondering how we know that he came to the Laramie Plains in 1957, or 1857. Well, when he got here, he took a selfie, and he posted it on Facebook. And so we're pretty sure that that's when it all happened. But Albert Houston, and I'll probably call him Al, Albert Houston was, as I said, a very colorful character. When he was hired to provide meat for the stage station and also the fort in 1857, they said, "We want you to just provide as much meat as you can provide." Well, after he signed the contract, there were so many wild game carcasses hanging in the trees and all over the place that they couldn't process them fast enough. So they had to go back in and they begged him to modify the contract. So they modified the contract to provide as much meat as they needed. And as you'll see as we go along here, after Albert did that, he started homesteading ranches actually in the Laramie Plains. But and I want to create a little bit of a timeline here, but I also want to tell you what he was. Now in about 1860, the city of Laramie, which is what it was called at the time, was at the end of the rail line and was just a town in disarray. There were thieving groups and groups that would, the prostitution houses and the gambling houses were abundant in Laramie. And the town was run amok with lawlessness, frankly. And so in about 1860, they finally hired a sheriff called Boswell. And in this book, I found Albert Houston's name. And they hired Boswell to clean up the town. And with Boswell and without Boswell, there was a group of vigilantes that started going through town and rounding up these lawless creatures and actually executing them. Albert Houston was part of that vigilante group. And it was part of what allowed families to move into Laramie. Wives refused to come to join their husbands here because there was so much robbery and thievery going on. You couldn't even be safe after the sun went down. And in that book, it said that they used Albert Houston's rope to hang this one guy. And so I just thought that cut starts to create a little bit of flavor to who Albert Houston was. He was a very tough individual. And if you haven't figured it out, he was 17 when he came out here. And it is told that his marksmanship was unbelievable. They said that he could do as much damage with his Winchester repeater as a military Gatling gun. It was also said that he could throw a can up in the air and he could shoot it 3 times before it hit the ground. Now, I can't even imagine how hard that would be to do with a rifle. However, I will tell you that there are accounts that have said that Buffalo Bill Cody, and I would tell you he was a wonderful showman, but Al Houston was he was a marksman. And he didn't stand for braggarts. He actually challenged Buffalo Bill Cody to a shooting match, and Cody decided to decline. So and I just want to say that the Civil War was happening in 1861 to 1865. So it was actually prior to, he came to the Laramie Plains prior to the Civil War. And then something that becomes rather poignant in our history in the Platte Valley is that the Sand Creek Massacre that happened down in Colorado, which created huge Indian uprising among other skirmishes for sure, that happened in 1864. So it began to affect a lot of the pioneer ranches up and down the River Valley. And so in 1865, Frances Ann Hotchkiss, she traveled down the Great Platte River Road to Fort Laramie. And that's what we call the Oregon Trail today. And so she's my great-great-grandmother. She married Albert Houston in 1865 at Fort Laramie. And they had 8 children. And then in 1872, they moved to Cow Creek and homesteaded on Cow Creek. And they built the homestead that I believe that Cody and Georgia Miller live in today, which is owned by the Silver Spur. And so that's where they homesteaded. And he was, as a wonderful marksman that he was a well-known hunting guide. And so these dignitaries from England would come over and would hire him to take them hunting. And he went all over the Colorado, Wyoming territories at the time and took them hunting. And out of the 8 children that they had, I won't get too far ahead of myself here. They had one child, Minnie Houston, right here. She married Willis Edwin Sears. Now these are my great-great-grandparents. And Ed Sears actually homesteaded on Cow Creek in 1884. He came to the North Platte Valley in 1881, and he worked for Al Houston. And then he married Al Houston's daughter, Minnie, and they had my great-grandmother, Frances. And it was kind of interesting that when Al came to the valley, he partnershiped up with his brother, and they started ranching there, and I think they were leasing from Houston. And then, of course, then Sears started working for him. But also to make extra money, Ed Sears drove the stage from encampment to Fort Steele. And I think he did that a few times, but I think mostly he ran the stage from Saratoga to encampment. I found a picture years ago on that stage, which was crossing Cow Creek at the time. He, as was the custom in those days, they would ranchers would develop a homestead, and then they would buy up surrounding homesteads and then make their real estate holdings larger and larger as time went on. And of course, Ed Sears did the same thing. They actually sold out and moved to California 6 months before, and for 6 months, and then they returned to the valley because they missed it so much. And one thing I forgot to mention that Al Houston and his wife, they sold out in 1910 and moved to California to Santa Monica. And it doesn't say, but I believe that this is where Ed and Minnie and Frances moved to, was Santa Monica, California. Well, when they got out there, they just couldn't stand it. So they came back to the Platte Valley. And I think California was a little bit different then than it is today. So I'm gonna talk about them coming back to the valley, but before I do, I want to go to Alexander and Catherine McPhail. These are also my great-great-grandparents. They homesteaded on North Spring Creek in 1889. I believe the house that they homesteaded, the thing about genealogy and sorting through all this information is you get bogged down with a lot of stuff. And the fear with sharing this with all of you is too much information. But I believe that the house that they homesteaded is the house that Berger Ranchers own today on North Spring that Kyle and Stacy Berger live in today. Now, I think that's true. But they came from Scotland, so both of them are full-blood Scots. And Alexander came out here with his brother Donald. Donald actually spelled his name differently than Alex did. And for whatever it's worth for any of you way back historians, they go back to the Cameron clan, was a hugely significant clan in the country of Scotland. The McPhails were charter members of the Saratoga Presbyterian Church here in town. And they had 5 children, which included Stuart McPhail. I call him Stuart. He goes by, his real name was John Stuart, but I'm going to call him Stuart. And he is my great-grandfather. Now, before we get to Stuart, this is Alexander McPhail when he was a teenager, wearing the kilt and the clan plaid, and then in Scotland. And I just thought that was kind of fun to share. So my grandfather, Stuart McPhail, married Frances Sears, and it was a bit of a tragedy here. Stuart died when he was 46 years old. They only had, now, Frances was the only child of Ed and Minnie Sears, but this couple had 3 daughters, Margaret, Marjorie, and Mildred. And Marjorie is my grandmother. And when Stuart married Frances, this was before they all moved to California, but they actually built a house across the creek from Frances's parents, Ed and Minnie Sears, across the creek on Cow Creek. That place is the place that Guy and Lael Notwell live in today. And it's also part of the Silver Spur Ranch. But anyway, they moved across the river and they ranched together until they sold out in what was it, 1916, and they moved out to California. And then when they got out there, they just couldn't stand it. And the whole family, Stuart and Frances and Ed and Minnie Sears, they came back to the valley. Well, when they came back to the valley, they purchased what is now the old Runner Ranch, but at the time they bought it from Starrett. And they bought the ranch in 1917, and so that was the beginning of the registered Hereford Ranch. Stuart and Ed put together their new Hereford Ranch, and they bought one of their premium bulls from L.G. Davis, which is a prominent Hereford breeder that some of you old-timers would remember in the valley. When they moved back to the ranch, Ed Sears, he contracted McManus and Simonis. I don't know if those names are familiar to you. They're not really to me. But they contracted those 2 guys to build the ranch house that is there today. And it's huge. And he wanted to make sure that when he built that house, that it was big enough for both families. And that house was big enough for 2 families, clear up until today, as far as I know. Our family had 2 families living in there up until the time we even sold it. Also, in not too long after that, with the winters and the distance from town, Ed Sears had a house in town built where he and Minnie would eventually move to. That house today, I think today, is known as the Far Out West Bed and Breakfast. But anyway, it was kind of a deja vu when Jean and I came back to town, because there was a tour, and I was going through this house and it was like, my gosh, it's like I should, it's like I should have lived here at one time. But anyway, so that's kind of how that started to work. Now when Stuart died, when they came back, this would be a picture of Stuart and Frances on the river ranch down at the river in about 1917. This would be a picture of Stuart while he's on horseback there. But the high school FFA chapter is technically named after Stuart. It's called the Stuart McPhail FFA chapter, and I remember when we were members of the alumni chapter, it was the Stuart McPhail alumni chapter as well. So that's, I don't think they use it much anymore, but that's how it was chartered. And then along comes John Wayne. John Wayne, runner, married one of the McPhail girls, Marjorie. And when John was 13, he left home, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and he came out here by train. He lived with a family here in town, and he graduated with Marjorie from high school here. And then they got married, and they purchased their first ranch on Cedar Creek. Now, a little bit of history of John and Marge's relationship is when they were in high school, the hobo pole was still a very popular place, as it is today. It's not quite as, or at that time it wasn't quite as well developed, but the area residents would like to go down there and soak. Well, John, with my other grandfather, Riley Allen, and John's brother, Dwight, and a few other high school boys went down to the hobo pool, and they took all of their clothes off, got into the hobo pool, and were soaking. Well, my grandmother, Marjorie, with her sister, Margaret, and her other sister, Mildred, and a few other high school girls, which might have included Margaret Allen, they decided, they caught the boys at the hot pool and they were going to take their clothes, which they did. And they took their clothes, and Marjorie was driving the car at the time, and John is sitting there going, "What?" The boys are going, "What are we going to do? We're going to have to walk back through town naked." And so John says, "By God, I'm not." He jumped out of the pool, he ran to the car, and she had the car started, and he jumped on the floorboard of the driver's side, and she killed it when she put it in gear. And so they started pitching clothes out of the car. John walked back to the hot pool, and the boys were forever grateful that they didn't have to walk back through town in their birthday suits. So that was an early glimpse of their matrimony. Grandpa would say for years afterwards, he said, "I made it right with her, I married her." So on Cedar Creek, when John and Marge got married, they moved to Cedar Creek, and they bought which is what we call today the Reed Place, which is where Jeff and Sarah Keller live. The Conants own it now. But it was a log cabin, which I actually saw. Dad and I went down and looked at it here probably, I don't know, 8 years ago. But they lived in that log cabin, and that's where they started their ranching career. And so Marjorie and John Wayne had 4 sons, Jack, Bill, Bob, and Stu, and they adopted Grandpa John's nephew's Tommy, his sister's son, and she just didn't feel like she could take care of him, so he said that he would, but he demanded that he be part of the family. So they adopted Tom, and that's where the 5 runner boys come into play. And Bill is my dad, and let's see what we got here. So when John and Marge started their business, they were operating under the TC brand. It was registered under John. This is an actual photograph of the 1956 brand book, which I have up here, and you're welcome to look through it. But it's registered to John Runner, and that's where they started. I believe that the brand was actually registered in prior brand books, but the 1956 was the earliest brand book that I have, with exception of this replica of 1883. So as things happened, so John and Marge, after the death of Stuart McPhail, Frances remarried. She married Marvin Reed. And so Marvin and Frances were living on the Runner Ranch, or the River Ranch at the time. They traded their ranch to John and Marge for the ranch they were living on in Cedar Creek. So is this complicated enough for you? Well, anyway, it comes to Reed Place because that's where Frances and Marvin lived on Cedar Creek in Ranch. But when John and Marge moved to the River Ranch, they began developing the Hereford, the registered Hereford operation that Sears and McPhail had done such a good job in starting. And in 1951, this was the first of many annual bull sales that they would have going forward. And this would have been the Runner Hereford's first sale bill. And I didn't bring it with us today, but it's full of a lot of heifers and bulls and everything else that they had for sale at that time. But you can see this would be, I don't know if you can read it, this would be my father right here, Bill. This was Stuart, Bob, Jack, Tommy, and that's M.W. Dandy Larry, the fourth. Of course, when you're in the purebred business, you've got funny names for all these critters. That's John Runner showing one of the herd bulls that was prominent at the time. Within that sale bill, we show a group of sires with the four boys, and this would be Bob, Jack, Bill, and Stu. You can see that the Runner Herefords showed and competed at a lot of stock shows. Ogden was their favorite, but they also showed at Denver and Cow Palace in Los Angeles. So one thing that I think is really important to point out is before this time, and what was really important in starting John Runner's influence into the registered Hereford breed was the fact when he went to Ogden and bought a bull calf. And they bought this bull calf. They didn't have any way to get him home, so they took the back seat out of the car and put him in the car and brought him home. And anyway, he did just fine. He got here, and this was part of how our ranch history goes.
I liked it.
Now, as things go along, you can imagine in those days, times got a little bit tough. This is another herd bull we have very prominent in the Runner Hereford line. His registered name was Bacaldo Tone 16. We nicknamed him Tony. And stories about Tony, it was really something. But it was almost like I was there. But Tony, and you're not going to believe this, but I'm just going to tell you that what precipitates all this is John had borrowed a lot of money at the Saratoga State Bank. And he went in because his bull sales were just starting to get kicked off. He couldn't pay that debt off. He asked them if he could have any form of forbearance. They said no. So he took Tony to the Ogden Stock Show, and they sold Tony for $30,000 in the late 50s. Unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
John took that money and paid Saratoga State Bank off. in full. So that's began to what precipitated our influence, my father's influence, and his brother's influence into the Runner Herefords Corporation. So in 1962, prior to that, we expanded into Elk Mountain and bought the Doling Ranch and the Bowles Ranch. Those were our summer ranches. In 1962, we also bought 7 farms up in Pavilion. And what precipitates this is that in 1962, they moved Bill and his family, which is my dad, and Bob and his family, and Jack and his family up there to run those ranches up there. And as fate would have it, when we expanded into the Pavilion country, and if you don't know where Pavilion is, you're not from here. It's just outside of northwest of Riverton, Wyoming. But Pavilion was a place that you didn't just drive through. You meant to be there, or you were really lost. But when we moved to Pavilion, there was a young family that was living in what we called, one of the places that we bought, called the Gertson Place. And Harold and Ann Six had 3 young children, and one of them was Gene Six, Runner. And that was the first time that Gene and my paths crossed. And was in 1962 when we were 5 years old. And we didn't know each other because we went to different schools at the time, but then those schools consolidated, and then we went to middle school and high school together at Wind River. Now, on my mom's side is the Swansons, Allens, and Dodds, Allen, Alt, I'll explain, and Runner. Now, I think it's kind of important that maybe I tell you that I'm the 6th generation Houston. I'm the 5th generation Sears, McPhail, and 5th generation Swanson, Allen, and Dodds, and Alt, and 3rd generation Runner in this valley. Now you can see why we moved to Pavilion to expand our gene pool. So on my mother's side, sorry, I'm going to be in trouble. So if you people would stay for a long time, then it will prolong my punishment. So on my mom's side, we start with John Swanson and Mary Erickson Swanson. They were both born in Sweden, and they're my great-great-grandparents. They homesteaded on South Spring Creek in 1898. John actually came out here and worked on the railroad for years before that, but he actually homesteaded in 1898. They came to Fort Steele in 1872, but they came to Laramie Plains before that. Now, from John, let's see, John had, he had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Now, one of his sons, Frank Swanson, who was my great-grandfather, married Carrie Buffin, who was my great-grandmother. Frank died at a very young age. He was 38 years old. And they had 2 daughters, Margaret and May. And Margaret is my grandmother. And when Frank died, Carrie had 2 daughters. And you know how family trees go. Sometimes the foliage is a little bit too thick and you can't see through everything, but what happens is Carrie couldn't support her daughters. So she gave the 2 daughters to Charles Swanson, and Charles and Lillian raised them with their son Francis Swanson. If this is all making any connections with any of you old-timers. But so Francis grew up with my grandmother, Margaret, and her sister May. And Carrie had a rough start in life. After she loses Frank, she remarries later. But before that, Carrie's father, George Buffin, and they were, he would have been my for sure, let's see, great-great-grandparent, or great-great-grandfather. George, and I don't know how this all happened, this is another really foggy part, but George was blind. And there was something wrong with him, so they sent him to Denver. They took out part of his skull, and for whatever reason, they sent him home and said, you need to come back and we'll fit you with the plate and we'll go on about life. Well, I think what happened a lot of those pioneer days is they said, I'm not going to let them do that to me again. He never went back. In 1903, in a jury of his peers, he was certified insane, right here in Saratoga, and a sheriff by the name of Sisson, which is a familiar name, after he was convicted certifiably insane, took him to Walcott. He was met in Walcott by people from the hospital in Evanston, and they took him to Evanston, and he died in 1954, or 1904. And so he lasted 1 year in Evanston. So Carrie had a tough start in life, and honestly, I never knew her. She died when I was 2 years old, but she is married at the Saratoga Cemetery. On the Swanson Ranch, this is a picture of Frank, showing him with a team of horses mowing hay, and a plunger team up there stacking hay on what I don't know if we still call it, but that's what we used to call the beaver slide. And that's what we used to stack hay with, or how we used to stack hay. So along comes the Allen side of the family. George and Azuba, oh, and you might be interested in this. So Francis Swanson marries Dixie Swanson, or Dixie, I can't remember the maiden name now. Dixie, but she was from Rushville, Nebraska. They adopted a boy by the name of Charlie Swanson. Once Charlie sold the ranch, his share of the ranch, he was a neighbor when we moved back to town out north here, and just a real delight to be around. He could talk to anybody for a long time. But he created quite a wonderful relationship with Jean's dad when they would come and see us. But back on Spring Creek, George and Azuba Allen, who are my great-great-grandparents, we've got time, so hang in there with me. They had 2 sons, John and Gilbert. Now, they came out here with 2 daughters, and they homesteaded on Pass Creek in 1880. And so what happened with the 2 daughters, they are not Azuba's daughters, but George, when he was 13, ran away from home, joined the Civil War. And while he was away, his wife died, and when he came back, then he put his 2 daughters in charge, or he put Azuba in charge of his 2 daughters. And then he came out here to find a place to homestead, went back and got his new family, married Azuba, came out here and had 2 sons, John and Gilbert. Gilbert would be my great-grandfather. And he grew up in this homestead on Pass Creek in 1880. that, by the way, is part of the TA ranch. And in 1880, 1881, the Indian uprisings were still happening. And whenever that would happen, at least on Pass Creek, the pioneers would get together and they would go and help other pioneers either defend their homesteads or pioneers would help them defend theirs. Well, they heard about the Indians coming through on the east side of Elk Mountain, and so they, George and his neighbors went to help, and they left all the women and children at this homestead. And they were expected to be home by dark, and they didn't come home. So Azuba and the women, they boarded up. They were afraid that the Indians had overrun everybody, and so they boarded up the doors and the windows, and just for extra measure, they took barbed wire and they strung it over the doors and the windows of this brand new homestead. Well, they didn't think this through because the kids had to go to the bathroom and everything else, and so it created all kinds of safety issues, but nonetheless, they stuck it out. Well, the men showed up the next day, and they came, and the women had, by then, they had taken the boards off the doors and the windows and tried to take as much of the barbed wire off as they possibly could. And George was just aghast at the appearance of his new homestead with the split window seals and the broken doors and scratched up, and it was just a mess. And George says, "What were you guys thinking?" He said, "What if they would have set the house on fire?" Well, the women admitted that they hadn't thought it clear through. But anyway, that was one incident on Pass Creek. And by the way, they didn't find any Indians. Now, I wish I had some pictures, but Perryalt came to Pass Creek in 1890, and he actually worked for George Allen. He married George's daughter, Effie, in 1892. Perry and Effie established their own ranch in 1894 on Pass Creek, and their son Raymond was born in 1895. They also had two other daughters. And then we've got Jasper Dodds, who comes to Pass Creek. Jasper would have been my great-great-grandparents. Jasper freighted copper ore at encampment in 1906-07, and he moved to Pass Creek in 1908. And Jasper helped build the Saratoga Encampment Railroad. He was a foreman on that railroad. And he had a daughter, he had one daughter, and Murley married Gilbert Allen, who is George Allen's son, in 1908. And then they divorced in 1920. Now I'm told, this is another dark spot in my family tree, but Gilbert would be gone for months at a time, and might have been a gambler, I don't know. But anyway, they had 3 sons and a daughter before they got divorced in 1920. And just for what it's worth, this brand is, that was found on an online brand book in 1912. And J.R. Dodd had this brand registered to him at that time, which is a brand that I own today. So after their divorce, Raymond marries Murley Dodds Allen, and they're my great-grandparents. Now, for those of you that are paying attention, are wondering at this point whether my family tree does fork. And it does.
Yeah.
But here's what happens. So Murley married Raymond's cousin, Gilbert, they got divorced, so Merle married Gilbert's cousin Raymond. But they didn't have any children after that. But Raymond did adopt Garrett Allen, Bernie Allen, Riley Allen, who was my grandfather, and Della Allen. And Riley was 6 years old when all this happened. So we get to my mom's parents, George Riley Allen and Margaret. You knew them as Riley and Margaret Allen. And they started their life in a basement house on Spring Creek. And it was the first house on the right-hand side of the county road. I believe Alcorn owns it today. In that day, I think this would be my mom and George Allen. And this would have been, I think Mom would have been in high school when they built the ground floor above the basement house. So my mom grew up in that house, and I remember as a kid going to that house, and it was almost like a garden museum. It was so well kept and cared for. The lawn was terraced down the hill, and it was gorgeous. And they had a fenced yard, but it was fenced with block. And the house was immaculate, and it was always a treat and a joy to go see Grandma and Grandpa Allen. Again, my mom is Charlene. My Uncle George, who died a few years ago. Riley died at a very young age in when he was 59. I was in high school at the time, and remember it like it was yesterday. He had a scarlet fever at one time, and it just created all kinds of complications for him as time went on. So when Margaret Allen died, I got this can of rocks. It's an old tin cream can about like that. And I thought, wow, what an inheritance. A few years ago, I sorted through that can, and it was only 2 years ago that I dug out some pieces that were worth showing, and I put them in this frame. Grandma and Grandpa Allen were avid rock hounds. Every spare minute they had, they were out hunting arrowheads and Indian artifacts and anything that had any old ancient history to it. A lot of these pieces actually came from the old Bolton Ranch, which is the Overland Trail today. And the only reason I know that is when Grandma and Grandpa would go rock hunting, they always had a competition who could find more arrowheads. And it was just their life. They loved it. But they would take a little piece, tiny little piece of athletic tape, and they would put R.A. Bolton for Riley Allen, or M.A. Bolton, Riley Allen, or Medicine Bow, wherever they found it. And so we actually know where some of them came from.
Wow.
And anyway, that's on the wall at our house today. But they had much more beautiful pieces that they had framed in their house, and those are in other families' households today. My mom and dad, Bill and Charlene Runner, they had 5 sons. They raised 3 foster boys. In 1971, we sold the ranch, and it was kind of an event that we had a dwarf gene in our Hereford line, and so that was causing all kinds of problems for us. Plus the fact that when we moved to Pavilion in 1962 and bought all those places, and we bought the ranches on Elk Mountain, we borrowed a lot of money to do that. And also, I can remember vividly in the real early 70s, the calf prices were 30 cents. And I think a combination of all that just over leveraged our ranch, and we just didn't have a choice but to sell the ranch. So we did sell the ranch. And I'm not gonna go into this, but that ranch became the first ranch in the 80s, maybe one of the first ranches in the 80s, where they tried to, where the subsequent buyers tried to split the water rights off and move them to a different place, and they couldn't do it, because that's Wyoming state law. Joe Gloat will tell you just a little bit about that. But anyway, that is just a little bit of history on the Runner Ranch when we sold it. So after the sale of the ranch, my dad became the chief inspector for the state of Wyoming, chief brand inspector. He worked for the state of Wyoming as brand inspector for some 30 years. And Mom taught schools at Wind River during that time. So as families do, they tend to pick up the pieces and move on. So after we sold the ranch, John and Marge Runner, they moved to Pavilion also. And John, before he really entered retirement, he actually rode for the Wyoming Grazing or the Midvale Grazing Association up there at Pavilion for a few years. One thing that he did is when they moved up there, they cast Grandpa John in a Marlboro ad, and it was, and I've got it over there, and I would just really encourage you just to look some of that stuff over. But they cast him in a Marlboro ad as a chuck wagon cook in 1981. Funny what you're proud of. Back in the 50s, chariot races were going on. This is a photograph of John winning his chariot race at the old fairgrounds at what we call Stone Gates, up on top of the hill here. And I actually remember going to a rodeo as a very young man, boy, at that time. This would be a picture of 1927's high school basketball team. And on that team was my grandfather John Runner, my grandfather Riley Allen. If you read the caption, you were either a starter or a sub. They list Riley Allen as a sub, and they list John Runner as a forward. And I remember my grandpa Allen saying, yeah, he said when we get into a game and somebody be kind of beating John up a little bit, he said they'd put me in. He said I'd just knock him into the old fire burning stove there, and not too far off the court. And they'd have to sit down, and so then we would win the game. So during my mom and dad's life here, and so many of my pioneer ancestors, they lived through the blizzard of '49, and this is on Pass Creek. And this is digging out on Pass Creek. And we're right at the end here, but before I close, there's some things that are kind of fun to share that I'm going to, but I'm sure that some of you want to know how I came back here, but though I was born here, we came back here a lot. We would come back here in the summer times. I cowboyed with Grandpa John on Elk Mountain Ranch. I learned to mow hay with a side sickle mower on a John Deere B south of town, and a 16-foot dump rake. And it was also towards the end of our ranching history. But I think it was really good for me because I realized that there was no way in the world that I was going to work for my relatives. Now, my grandfather taught me so much about being a cowboy, and that was the funnest summer of my entire life. But Stu Runner, as my boss, was challenging. And some of you know him. and he'll admit it. But our families interacted and crossed paths along the way, and when my dad's family was on the ranch in Saratoga, they had a relationship with the Allens, and so George Allen would actually go out to the ranch, and Stu and George were the same age, and Stu decided that George ought to learn how to drive a hand-clutch John Deere A tractor. So he puts George up in the seat and tells him how to do it, and Stuart's right in front of the tractor and yelling and screaming like he was always wont to do. And so anyway, he said, well, put her in gear. So George slams the hand clutch, and it was already in gear, and it lurches forward, and Stu's back and forward, and he falls down in the mud puddle, and George drives single front. Drives right up on his chest before he gets this thing stopped. George says, what am I gonna do? Well, Stu said, you better get this son of a bitch off me or I'm gonna die. Well, he hadn't taught him reverse yet. So he put her in gear and he drove right over the top of Stu. And I think the only thing that saved his life was that big old mud puddle. And for years, he had front tire tracks right over the top of his forehead. And maybe that's why he's so hard-headed today, but he lived through it. There was a time when the boys were really young on the ranch in Saratoga. And my grandmother, Marjorie, was, we called her Grandma John. She was in the kitchen at the old ranch house, and she was butchering chickens. And it was hot, it was in the summertime, and she had blood all over, and she was sweating, and the boys were jacking around and fighting, and she had had all she could take. And she said, you boys get out of here, or you're gonna get a whipping. Well, you have to know my uncles, but they always embellish everything and make it way worse than it was. But certainly, they started yelling and screaming, and they would start busting out the screen door one at a time. Well, it just so happens there was a door-to-door salesman that was standing there at the front door. First one hits the screen door. He says, get out of here, she'll kill you. And the next one said, run for your lives. And it went on until they got to the fourth or fifth one. And Grandma was chasing them out. She had a butcher knife in her hand. And she hit that screen door and she sees this door-to-door salesman there. And she says, what the hell do you want? And he says, nothing, ma'am. And he left. So when I moved back, I brought my family back here in 1995. We had an opportunity to take over the management of the then Rollins National Bank, and spent 27 and a half wonderful years as the end of my career there. And it was a real privilege to be able to come back home to do that. And when I moved back here, it wasn't not long after Mom and Dad came to visit. And Scothia Benson sees my dad and she goes, are you Dan Runner's older brother? Well, he thought that was about the coolest thing in the world, which was the greatest insult in my life. And then Jack Runner, my uncle, Dad's older brother, stopped in to see me one day, and he goes, my God. He said, you look more like Bill than Bill does. So, I guess that's my family history, and so we reached the sunset of everything, and when I'm going through all this, I'm reminded of how much twists and turns and how much tragedy and triumph there are in my family history, and I would suppose yours is much the same. You know, I made this for my mom several years ago, or a few years ago, and it's what I call the calico box, and it's just put together with all different kinds of wood. And it dawned on me the other day that we are made up of different kinds of wood. And it makes us who we are. You've heard the phrase, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives, and that's true. But the different parts of our family tree, which we can't change, make us who we are. But by God's grace, we're allowed to make decisions and choices to make us who we'll become. And I know that my history is only special to me, and it's on slide. Your history isn't any different than mine. You've got tragedy and triumph. But at the end of the day, we are who we are, and we have a chance to become who we want to be. That's it. Thank you very much. I would encourage you to just spend some time and look around. I've got a yearbook, the Marlboro ad, some pictures over there of Raymond Alt, which hangs in our living room. There's a picture of Wyoming as a territory in 1883. Saratoga's not on that. And I think it was 1883 that Warm Springs became the first post office, later to Saratoga. But if you'll look there, the Houston Ranch is listed on Cow Creek. So spend some time. This is actually the same replica of the map that hangs in the Hotel Wolf. And I've got some brand books there. There's a replica of an 1883 brand book, and of those ranchers that were here in 1883 that registered brands, they are listed as living near Warm Springs. And just one more side note, that Al Houston's, he registered the brand 1 Bar 11. And that brand is a famous brand today, owned by CSU and Schultz here in town. And so some of these brands go on for a long time. So spend some time, and if you've got any questions, I would try to answer them, as long as it's not disparaging to me. So,
The Houston Wilderness?
Houston Wilderness is
Is that-
named after Al Houston. Yes, it is.
So Winnie Allen's husband, George, where did he fit in?
Okay, George is my uncle, my mom's brother. Yeah. And tragedy. You may recall that George and his first wife got a divorce, and George and Winnie then remarried, and George raised the two younger girls. The two older girls ended up with Verna and Virgil at the time.
I live at the Old Runner place.
Oh, wonderful.
And I have some questions about several different things. First of all, one of the stories I've come up with is when I moved into my house, several different people around town told me, oh, I lived there at one time, that in, I guess it was in the Depression years, that some families couldn't take care of their children, and they lived at the Runner place, and they would ride their bicycles to school, and that kind of fits in with out on where the old barn is, and out from there, there's concrete slabs that look like milking stations, and I heard there was a dairy there. So my guess is the kids help probably milk the cows, go to school, come back, milk.
They may have.
And
Oh, I'm sorry.
well, no, what my question is about the dairy, because there's two different, it looks like there were two different dairy barns that were torn down. In fact, another thing, Pearl James, after I moved in, she came out I met Daryl, and he said his mother and his parents had lived there. And she came out and when she got out of the truck, she said, my gosh, where's all the buildings? When Stewart sold the ranch to Arch Energy, they tore down a bunch of barns and the calving shed, they just tore everything down. And, but what's left there are, there's 2 sets of concrete slabs that look like they were dairy barns.
Yeah.
So was there a dairy?
Well, during the Sears McPhail runner time, there wasn't a full-fledged dairy. Now, I know they milked cows just to sustain themselves. And I know the boys had to milk cows, my dad talks about it. Not many, though, it wasn't like a dairy. And as far as the tearing down the buildings, I remember that there was a log loafing shed that was on the, it was actually attached to the old barn that came out of your yellow shed.
Okay, I know exactly where, because there's a gravel, you can tell there was a building there, but it's not like the concrete slabs.
Right. Now, that was more for cabin sheds and stuff like that. And then, I remember we had a bunkhouse, we also had a garage shop, which I think is still standing. But the
Part of it
bunkhouse,
has come down.
the
yeah.
bunkhouse is still, is gone. I hated that garage and shop because when we were haying, that was the shop that we had to go and knock the broken sickles out of the, or broken blades out of the
Yeah.
sickles and re-sharpen them and put them back in and stuff like that. Now, as far as kids living there, yeah, that happened, I know it happened.
Well, the way kids were shuffled around, I mean,
Yeah.
you mentioned that your family had a few shuffles,
Sure.
and I know that in the years that John and Marjorie there, I know they took kids in.
Well, there was a lot of young men that spent time out there in that ranch. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I know that Glenn Buff, I know he spent, and I think Butch Buff, I know they spent some time, some
Well, and Pearl
significant time out
James
there.
and her husband worked there and lived there, and her first child was born in that house.
Oh, interesting.
Because
Now,
they
see,
were
I didn't know that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
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 So, yeah. And that's, of course, see, my grandfather, he left home when he was 13 and came out here, and he lived with the family in town.
Yeah,
And so he had an affinity for young people in this area. And so I will say that. And that was another reason he adopted his sister's son, Tommy. And he said, if he's gonna be my son, he's gonna legally be my son. And so Tommy grew up as the 5th runner.
yeah, and I've heard that was a real wild bunch, that's another thing I've heard
Well,
stories about.
my grandfather,
That group of guys were
Riley
wild.
Allen, my grandfather Riley Allen would come out to the ranch once in a while, because he and Grandpa John were really good friends. He would come home and he would tell Margaret and my mom and George, oh my God, those runner boys will kill themselves.
Well,
I don't
that's what
think
I
they're
heard,
ever
that they
gonna grow
grew
up.
up fighting
Well, they were a
and they
tough group.
almost killed each other and,
And you know what, Patty, right?
yes,
Patty, this'll give you a case in point. In the 50s, when those boys were growing up, they would come to town and there would be street fights with what we call brush apes. And those were young men that would work for the Conservation Corps and the United States Forest Service at the time. And they would come to town and they were trying to date
Oh, boy.
their high school sweethearts and everything else. And my dad's front teeth were knocked out by a beer bottle right in front of the rustic. And I can remember, and this was before there were streets in Saratoga, I mean paved streets. And so there was a lot of confrontations that happened, not with just those runner boys, but a lot of the city young men around the country, or around the town. But I was going even in the 50s, I can remember before I was 5 years old, that my grandparents, Riley and Margaret, would bring me downtown. They would park backwards in street and it would be right kind of in front of the rustic area, but they would invariably, that was more entertainment watching the street fights than it was apparently going to the movies and stuff downtown. And so that was I've got a reputation in my history, for sure. So, thanks for coming. And you know what? When you let Dad and I go through and talk to you and go through part of the house, it was just a thrill for him.
Well,
Yeah, that was several years ago.
well, here's another story that you could verify or not. When the house is divided, and what I was told was that Stewart, who was running the lab before it was sold to Arch Energy, he was the last one managing, I guess.
Mhm.
And John and Marjorie and Stewart didn't get along, and so he walled them off.
Well,
One-
that could be. Sure could have been. Now, that was when it was walled off, before it wasn't.
That's my understanding, but
yeah.
it was walled off when Stewart
Yeah.
took over and John and Marjorie were put on it's still an apartment, I rent it out as an apartment.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where they lived.
Now, I remember that, well, I remember both sides of the house, didn't I? In my mind.
Yeah,
When you walked into the foyer of the part that John and Marge lived in,
mhm,
and I don't know when this happened, but when you walked in, there was a huge linoleum green floor that had a huge horned Hereford bull cut out into it. And it was
Wow.
beautiful, and it was impressive. I remember that like it was yesterday. Now, I don't know when that came out.
Still big.
And
Well,
I wish
I don't know,
we
because-
had pictures of it.
because the inn they lived in, there's a porch that has like a vinyl flooring on it that I haven't ever taken up. I'm going to one of these days, and then when you go.
If you
into-
do,
yeah,
if there's
into
a
the-
Hereford bull in there, you
Yeah,
gotta
we'll
call me.
see, yeah. But then it's just hardwood flooring, a very nice hardwood flooring when you come in.
Yeah.
But we'll,
Any other questions?
So about that, how, like, we still refer to that as the South Runner and
Yeah,
it's still,
well, when we moved to
when we
town,
move cows and when we go hay, that Ridge is like, I'm going to the South Runner.
when Gene and I moved back in 1995, we had ordered something that came UPS, and they kept delivering it to the old Runner Ranch.
I'll make it.
So it's still called the old Runner Ranch, I guess.
I mean,
So, there was another
we
question.
operate on it.
Okay, thank you for letting me bore you to death.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
It's fun.